More Americans died on a single Tuesday morning than on D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and 9/11, combined. Not in a world war. Not on foreign soil. Right here. In a Maryland cornfield. On an ordinary Tuesday in September 1862. And the man who could have stopped it, who had the troops, the numbers, the position, chose to do nothing. This is the story of Antietam. The bloodiest single day in all of American military history. And the truth behind what really happened that day has been buried under bronze statues and museum placards for over 160 years. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at the Civil War the same way again. What's up everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is where we dig into the parts of history that got left on the cutting room floor. The stuff your textbook covered in one paragraph and moved on from. Today we're going all in on September 17, 1862. The single bloodiest day in the entire history of the United States military. Before or since. And we're going to talk about three things nobody really connects together: the battle itself, the general who betrayed his president at the worst possible moment, and the secret document that the blood of Antietam finally unlocked. Let's get into it. The setup. To understand why Antietam was so devastating, you have to understand where both armies were mentally and physically by September of 1862. The Confederacy had just pulled off one of the most stunning reversals in military history. A few months earlier, Union forces were camped within sight of Richmond, the Confederate capital. The war seemed nearly over. Then Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia, launched a series of savage counterattacks, and drove the Union Army back. He followed that up by crushing a Union force at the Second Battle of Bull Run in late August. Lee was now riding the biggest winning streak of the entire war. And he made a bold decision. He was going to invade the North. His thinking was strategic and almost coldly brilliant. 1. A victory on Northern soil would demoralize the Union public, who were already exhausted and questioning whether the war was worth it. 2. It would give war-weary Virginia farmers a break from having both armies camp on and consume their land. 3. And most importantly, a Confederate victory on Northern soil might finally convince Britain and France to formally recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. That foreign recognition could mean financial aid, naval support, possibly even direct military intervention. It could end the war in the South's favor almost immediately. So in early September 1862, Lee led roughly 40,000 Confederate soldiers, many of them barefoot, many of them half-starved, many of them carrying nothing but a rifle and a prayer, across the Potomac River into Maryland. They were outnumbered. They were exhausted. And they were walking into a trap they didn't know existed yet. Because here's the thing. Union General George McClellan had just been handed the most extraordinary piece of military intelligence in the entire Civil War. And what he did with it, or rather, what he failed to do, is one of the great what-ifs of American history. The Lost Order. On September 13th, 4 days before the battle, 2 Union soldiers from Indiana were resting in a field near Frederick, Maryland, a field that Confederate troops had camped in just days before. One of the soldiers noticed something lying in the grass. 3 cigars, wrapped in a piece of paper. He picked it up. The paper was Special Orders Number 191, Robert E. Lee's complete operational plan for the entire Maryland campaign. It outlined exactly where each division of the Confederate Army was going, who commanded them, and when they were supposed to arrive. It was the Confederate playbook, written in Lee's own hand, lying in a field. McClellan received it that afternoon. He reportedly told an aide, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." He had everything he needed. He knew Lee had split his army into multiple pieces spread across the Maryland countryside. He knew exactly where each piece was. All he had to do was move fast, hit each piece before they could reunite, and destroy the Confederate army in detail. McClellan had 18 hours. He used almost none of them. He waited 16 hours before issuing orders to move. 16 hours. Lee received a tip from a Confederate sympathizer that McClellan had the lost order, and immediately began pulling his scattered forces back together. By the time McClellan's army arrived to fight, the trap had partially closed. The element of surprise, the most valuable thing in warfare, was gone. And now both armies converged on a small creek in western Maryland called Antietam. What happened next unfolded in 3 distinct waves of slaughter, each one more horrifying than the last. The Cornfield. At dawn on September 17, Union General Joseph Hooker's corps moved through a thick morning fog toward a 24-acre cornfield on the farm of David Miller. The stalks were head high. Confederate troops from Georgia were crouched at the far end, invisible. When the Union soldiers broke through the corn, the Georgians rose and opened fire. The first volleys were devastating. Within minutes, the corn was being cut down by bullets like a scythe. Soldiers later said the stalks fell as though a machine had gone through them. Both sides poured more men in. Hooker's corps clashed with Stonewall Jackson's veterans in a grinding, suffocating melee at close range, sometimes 50 yards, sometimes less. The cornfield changed hands 6 times before noon. 6 times men advanced into it, drove the enemy out, and were then driven out themselves. One Union general reported that his division of 2,500 men was reduced to fewer than 600 in less than 2 hours. The dead were so thick on the ground that soldiers later said it was physically impossible to cross the field without stepping on a body. A Confederate officer from Texas wrote in his diary that evening, and I quote, he described seeing men fall so fast it was like watching wheat before a reaper. End quote. By mid-morning, 15,000 Americans had already been killed or wounded. And the battle was just getting started. But the worst was still ahead. Because now the fighting shifted to a narrow country lane, and what happened there earned it a name that soldiers never forgot. Bloody Lane. South of the cornfield, running between 2 farms, was an old sunken road. Generations of wagon traffic had worn the road down 4 or 5 feet below the level of the surrounding fields. Confederate defenders packed into it like a natural trench. From inside the road, they could pour fire over the edge while being nearly impossible to hit from above. Union forces charged across the open ridgeline toward that road again and again. The Irish Brigade, one of the most celebrated units in the Union Army, mostly recent immigrants from Ireland, advanced with green sprigs of boxwood in their caps, as was their tradition. They walked into a wall of Confederate fire and were cut down by the hundreds. Their commander, General Thomas Marr, later said his brigade had been virtually annihilated. Wave after wave of Union soldiers came forward. Wave after wave was cut down. Then, after nearly 4 hours of this, 2 Union officers spotted an opening on the Confederate flank. They maneuvered their regiments to fire directly down the length of the road rather than across it. The effect was catastrophic. The men packed tightly inside the sunken road had no cover from enfilading fire, fire coming from the end rather than the side. The Confederate defense collapsed. Men fell in piles on top of each other inside the road. When it was over, Union soldiers walked down into the road and could barely see the ground for the bodies. More than 5,500 additional men had fallen along that road in approximately 3.5 hours. The sunken road had a new name now. Soldiers called it what they saw: Bloody Lane. And just when it seemed like the Union might finally break the Confederate line, George McClellan did something that military historians are still arguing about to this day. McClellan's betrayal. McClellan had roughly 65,000 troops on the field that day. Lee had approximately 40,000. By early afternoon, after the fighting at the Cornfield and Bloody Lane, Lee's army was battered, stretched, and in some places nearly broken. Multiple Union commanders sent urgent messages to McClellan. Now is the moment. Send in the reserves. Push forward. Finish them. McClellan had an entire fresh corps, approximately 20,000 men who had not fired a single shot all day, sitting on a ridge behind the Union lines. He refused to commit them. His stated reasoning, in his own dispatches, was that he was worried about a Confederate counterattack. He needed to keep the reserves to protect against that. But Lee had virtually nothing left to counterattack with. Confederate officers later confirmed that by mid-afternoon, there were sections of the Confederate line held by literally a few hundred exhausted men. A single fresh Union division could have punched through. The Army of Northern Virginia would have been surrounded, cut off from the Potomac, and destroyed. McClellan didn't move. Late in the afternoon, on the southern end of the battlefield, Union General Ambrose Burnside had finally forced a crossing of Antietam Creek at a stone bridge, a crossing that had taken nearly 3 hours against 500 Georgia riflemen. Burnside pushed the Confederate right flank back toward Sharpsburg. Lee's army was on the literal edge of collapse. Then Confederate General A.P. Hill arrived. His division had marched 15 miles at a dead run from Harper's Ferry, still wearing the blue Union uniforms they had captured there, and slammed into Burnside's flank. The Union advance stopped. The battle ground to a halt as darkness fell. Lee withdrew across the Potomac the next night, under cover of darkness, largely unmolested. McClellan did not pursue. Abraham Lincoln was, by all accounts, barely able to contain his fury. But here's the part that changes everything. 5 days after the guns stopped at Antietam, Lincoln walked into a cabinet meeting and did something he'd been waiting months to do. Lincoln had drafted the Emancipation Proclamation back in July 1862. His Secretary of State William Seward had told him to wait, don't issue it after a string of Union defeats. It'll look like a last gasp. Issue it from a position of strength, or don't issue it at all. So Lincoln waited. He carried the document for weeks. And Antietam, bloody, inconclusive, tactically indecisive Antietam, gave him just enough of a foothold to call it a victory. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Effective January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in Confederate states would be declared legally free. The strategic impact was immediate and global. Britain and France had been actively considering formal recognition of the Confederacy, which would have meant financial backing, trade agreements, possibly even military support. But both nations had already abolished slavery. Once Lincoln formally tied the Union war effort to abolition, no European government could back the Confederacy without being seen as backing the institution of slavery. The British textile industry was suffering badly from the Union naval blockade cutting off Confederate cotton, and there was genuine public pressure on the British government to intervene. That pressure died almost overnight. Recognition never came. The Confederacy was isolated from the world. Frederick Douglass, who had lived in slavery and had become the most powerful abolitionist voice in America, said the proclamation was the turning point he had fought his entire life toward. He called slavery the stomach of the rebellion. Antietam was the day Lincoln finally decided to cut it out. The history books remember Antietam. But they tend to tell you what happened without telling you what it meant. Without telling you how close it came to being even worse. Without telling you that the man commanding the Union Army that day had an opportunity to end the war, and walked away from it. That's the hidden truth of the bloodiest day in American history. And if you made it this far, you now know more about Antietam than most Americans ever will. If this hit different, go ahead and drop a comment. I want to know which part shocked you most. Was it McClellan holding back the reserves? Was it the lost order? The photographs? Let's talk about it below. If you're new here and this is the kind of history content you've been looking for, the real stuff, the uncomfortable stuff, the parts that actually matter, subscribe. New video every week. No fluff. And if you want to go deeper on the Civil War specifically, I've got a full video on the Battle of Gettysburg and why the second day of that battle nearly destroyed the Union. Watch that next. I'll see you in the next one.